All right, in this video, we're going through Francis Fukuyama's second volume, and I'm not going to read through. I'm reading through individually. Volume one, volume one does cover essentially the origins of political order from pre-human times to the French Revolution. Volume 2, in which he gives his introduction, covers the political order and political decay from the Industrial Revolution to the globalization of democracy. Other books, which are fantastic by Francis Fukuyama, is The End of History and The Last Man, which is probably one of his most important works in regard to history and government, as well as political science. But it's really mostly a book in regards to history, or a philosophy of history. He talks about development and how development is a coherent process that produces general and specific evolution or change, the convergence of institutions across culturally disparate societies over tens of thousands of years. And of course, we have The Great Disruption, another book by Fukuyama with the subtitle Human Nature and the Reconstitution of Social Order. Another one titled State Building with the subtitle Governance and World Order in the 21st Century. And so I'm reading through The Origins of Political Order from Pre-Human Times to the French Revolution, Volume 1, and Political Order and Political Decay from the Industrial Revolution to the Globalization of Democracy, Volume 2. These publications were put forward, I would say, in the 21st century, around the year 2015 CE. And so these are really great books, very extensive volumes. I would say probably around 500 to 600 pages each. I am reading through both of them, but I'm only going to provide on my channel the preface to the first volume and the introduction to the second volume. This is the introduction to the second volume, titled Political Order and Political Decay from the time of the Industrial Revolution, at least the first one, to the globalization of democracy. We start with the introduction titled The Development of Political Institutions up until the time of the French Revolution. And so, I want you to quote, "Consider a number of very different scenarios that have been playing out at the beginning of the second decade of the 21st century. In Libya, in 2013 CE, a militia armed with a panoply of heavy weapons briefly kidnapped the country's prime minister, Ali Zaidan, demanding that his government provide them with back pay. Another militia hath shut down much of the country's oil production, which is virtually the only source of export earnings. Other militias were earlier responsible for the killing of United States Ambassador Christopher Stevens in Benghazi, and for shooting dozens of demonstrators in the capital, Tripoli, who protested their continuing occupation of the city. These militias were formed in various parts of the country in opposition to Libya's longtime dictator, Muammar Gaddafi, whom they ousted with significant help from NATO in the first year of the Arab Spring in 2011. The protests against authoritarian governments that broke out that year, not just in Libya, but also in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and other Arab countries, were often propelled by demands for greater democracy. But 2 years later, democracy, as it is practiced in Europe and North America, seems like a distant dream. Libya since has then taken some tentative steps toward establishing a constituent assembly that would write a new constitution. But at the moment, its most fundamental problem is that it lacks a state, that is, a central authority that can exercise a monopoly of legitimate force over its territory in order to keep peace and enforce the law. And so we're going to see a developing theme in Fukuyama's writings. We're going to see the development of the state, obviously. We're going to see a history of other developments of the state, not only in China, but also in India as well. We can see the importance of the American Revolution and the French Revolution in other democracies and developing countries around the world. And we're also going to see that they also developed a rule of law. Also, we're going to see differences between patrimonial and also emergence of the state. We're also going to see democratic accountability with that as well. In other parts of what one would say Africa, states claiming a monopoly of force exist on paper and are less chaotic than Libya, but they remain very weak states. Radical Islamist groups, having been pushed out of South Asia and the Middle East, have been setting up in countries with weak governments, such as Mali, Nigeria, and Somalia, for example. The reason that this part of the world is so much poorer in terms of income, health, education, and the like, then booming regions like East Asia can be traced directly to its lack of strong governmental institutions. Over the same time period, a very different scenario was playing out in the United States with regard to its financial sector. The United States is in many ways at the opposite end of the political spectrum from post-Gaddafi Libya. It has a very large and well-institutionalized state, one that dates back far more than 200 years, and in fact draws on a deep well of democratic legitimacy. And as we will see in Fukuyama's writings, he talks about the importance of institutions and how institutions is the foundation of a solidified state. But that state is not working well, and its problems may be related to the fact that it is too institutionalized, and Fukuyama is talking about the United States. Prior to the financial crisis of the year 2008 CE, there were nearly a dozen federal agencies with regulatory authority over financial institutions, as well as banking and insurance regulators in each of the 50 states. For all of this regulation, however, the United States government was nonetheless unaware of the looming supreme mortgage crisis, which allowed the banks to take on excessive leverage and permitted the emergence of a huge shadow banking system built around derivatives that were too far complex to properly value. Some commentators have tried to blame the crisis exclusively on government-guaranteed mortgages from agencies, which did, in fact, contribute to the meltdown. But the private sector was a happy participant feeding the mortgage frenzy and could take undue risks because large banks knew that they would ultimately get bailed out by the government if they were in trouble. And this is exactly the scenario that occurred in the wake of the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy, to a near collapse of the global payment system and the deepest United States recession since the times of the Great Depression. What is perhaps more shocking, however, is what has happened since the crisis. Despite widespread recognition of the enormous risk posed by too big to fail banks, the American banking sector became even more concentrated than it was in 2008. In the years following the crisis, Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act that was supposed to solve the problem, but the legislation ignored simpler remedies such as sharply raising bank capital requirements or putting hard caps on the size of financial institutions in favor of a highly complex stew of new regulations. 3 years after passage of the legislation, many of those detailed rules had not yet been written and would likely not solve the underlying too-big-to-fail problem, even if they were. There are two fundamental reasons for this failure. The first has to do with the intellectual rigidity. The banks, in their own self-interest, have argued that strong new regulations of their activities would cut into their ability to lend and therefore undermine economic growth, while producing harmful unintended consequences. Such arguments, while producing harmful unintended consequences, arguments are often quite valid when applying to non-financial institutions like manufacturing industries. But as the scholars have shown, large banks are very different from non-financial firms due to their ability to harm the rest of the economy in ways not possible for a manufacturing company. The second reason for the failure is that the banks are very rich and powerful and can hire a legion of high-priced lobbyists to work on their behalf. Some have found arguments against new regulation persuasive based on their ideological beliefs, and for others, the arguments were a useful cover to protect the stream of campaign contributions flowing from the banking sector. Third, the protests that broke out in Turkey. As you know, Turkey and Brazil in 2013. These two countries were leading emergent market economies, which had seen rapid economic growth. And unlike the Arab dictatorships, both were democracies with competitive elections. Had initially made his marks as mayor of Istanbul, and we're talking about Prime Minister Recep Erdogan, who hailed from a socialist party. And despite these impressive economic and political accomplishments, both countries were briefly convulsed with mass protests against their governments. I'm only going to briefly mention the big points of Fukuyama's introduction. In Brazil, the issue was corruption and a failure of the government in order to provide a reliable basic service, even while spending billions of monetary notes to host the Summer Olympic Games. What linked these protests to each other was the fact that they were driven primarily by the middle class. Tunisia and Egypt, for example, had experienced lower rates of growth than Turkey or Brazil. Nonetheless, both produced large numbers of university graduates whose hopes for work and career were stymied by the cronyism of the country's autocratic regimes. Government had to deliver better results if it was to be regarded as legitimate, and needed to be more flexible and responsive to changing public demands. China, for example, another economic success story, has begun to face similar challenges from its rising middle class, which now numbers in the hundreds of millions. While they have been the beneficiaries of the country's breakneck economic growth over the past generation, they have different and higher expectations of government. The survival of the political systems of all of these countries will depend critically on the degree to which they can adapt to the new social landscape created by economic growth. An important thing to notice here is the ability to adapt to one's, not only one's environment, but to one's circumstances. Problems are driven by specific policies. When concerning the problem with government, certain policies, personalities, and historical context. But they are in fact linked by a common thread that serves as a background condition for all political life, and that is what Fukuyama calls institutions. Institutions, in Fukuyama's definition, are stable, valued, recurring patterns of behavior that persist beyond the tenure of individual leaders. They are, in essence, that is, institutions, persistent rules that shape, limit, and channel human behavior. Until there is a single central source of authority that exercises a legitimate monopoly of force in the country, for example, we're talking about Libya, there will be no citizen security or the conditions for individuals to flourish. The United States has long-standing and powerful institutions. Government institutions that are supposed to serve public purposes have been captured by powerful private interests, such that democratic majorities have a difficult time asserting their control. The problem is not just one of money and power. It also has to do with rigidities of the rulers themselves and of the ideas that support them. In the case of emerging market countries like Turkey and Brazil, the problem is one of social change outstripping existing institutions. By definition, institutions are persistent patterns of behavior that are created in response to the needs of a particular historical moment. But societies create new social classes, educate their citizens, and employ new technologies. Existing institutions often fail to accommodate these new actors, and as a result come under pressure to change. The study of development, or development, that is, change in human societies over time, is not an endless catalog of personalities, events, conflicts, and policies. It necessarily centers around the process by which political institutions emerge, evolve, and eventually decay. And if we are to understand the fast-changing political and economic developments of our contemporary world, it is important to put them into the context of the long-term story of the underlying institutional structure of societies. The present book is the companion volume of The Origins of Political Order from Pre-Human Times to the French Revolution. This project started out as an effort to rewrite and update Samuel P. Huntington's classic Political Order in Changing Societies. Also a great book, first published in 1968. The current volume takes its title from the first chapter of the latter book, which in turn was based on an article originally published in World Politics. Huntington's work was critical in making people understand that political development was a separate process from economic and social growth, and that before a polity could be democratic, it had to provide basic order. The first volume gave an account of the origins of three critical sets of political institutions. Again, that of the state, that of the rule of law, and procedures promoting democratic accountability. It explained how these institutions separately or in combination emerged or failed to emerge in China, India, the Middle East, and Europe. The first volume began with primitive human societies. No, not with primitive human societies, but with mankind's primate ancestors, because political order is rooted in human biology. And contrary to the theories of philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau or modern neoclassical economists, science now shows us that human beings did not start out as isolated individuals who gradually came to form societies over the course of historical time. The behaviorally modern human beings who emerged somewhere in Africa about 50,000 years ago were socially organized from the start, just like their primate forebears. Natural human sociability is built around two phenomena: kin selection and reciprocal altruism. The first is a recurring pattern by which sexually reproducing animals behave altruistically toward one another in proportion to the number of genes that they share. That is, they practice nepotism and favor genetic relatives. Reciprocal altruism involves an exchange of favors or resources between unrelated individuals of the same species, or sometimes between members of different species. Both behaviors are not learned but genetically coded and emerge spontaneously as individuals interact. Human beings are social animals by nature, but their natural sociability takes the specific form of altruism toward family or genetic relatives and friends, who are individuals with whom one has exchanged favors. This default form of human sociability is universal to all cultures and historical periods in time. Natural sociability can be overridden by the development of new institutions that provide incentives for other types of behavior, for example, favoring a qualified stranger over a genetic relative. But it constitutes a form of social relationship to which humans always revert when such alternative institutions break down. Human beings by nature are also norm-creating and norm-following creatures. They create rules for themselves that regulate social interactions and make possible the collective action of groups. These rules can be rationally designed or negotiated. Norm-following behavior is usually grounded not in reason, but in emotions like pride, guilt, anger, and shame. And again, to quote David Hume, reason is the slave of passion, and norms are often given a intrinsic value and even worshipped, as in the religious laws of many different societies. Since an institution is nothing more than a rule that persists over time, human beings have a natural tendency to institutionalize their behavior, and due to the intrinsic value with which they are typically endowed, institutions tend to be highly conservative, that is, resistant to change. And so, too conservative means that people will resist change. And we have the evolution from the band level society to the tribe level society. For the first 40 or so thousand years of the existence of the modern human species, and again, we're talking about anatomically modern humans, individuals were organized into what anthropologists label band-level societies, consisting of small groups of individuals, almost all of them genetic relatives, who subsisted off hunting and gathering. And we're talking about groups of 20 or so people or less. The first major institutional transition, which occurred perhaps 10,000 years ago, was the shift from band to tribal level societies, which are organized around a belief in the power of dead ancestors and unborn descendants. We typically call these tribes, or anthropologists sometimes use the term, segmentary lineages, to describe individuals who trace ancestry to a common progenitor who might be several generations removed. Such tribal societies existed in ancient China, ancient India, Greece, Rome, the Middle East, and pre-Columbian America. Think about the Mesoamerican peoples, for example, and the Germanic forebears of modern Europeans. Tribal societies have no central source of authority. As with band-level societies, they tend to be highly egalitarian and have no third-party enforcement of laws. They prevailed over band-level societies largely because they were capable of achieving enormous scale simply by pushing back the dating of common ancestry. Both band-level and tribal-level societies are rooted in kinship and therefore human biology. But the shift to tribal organization required the emergence of religious idea, belief in the ability of dead ancestors and unborn descendants to affect health and happiness in one's current life. This is an early example of ideas playing a critical, independent role in human development. And so we will talk about the emergence of the state, then we will go and talk about the rule of law, and then we will talk about unconcentrated powers of the state and democratic accountability. And so we'll talk about the state, the rule of law, and democratic accountability. Before moving on and talking a little bit about the French Revolution, and then after that we will talk mainly about the foundations laid in the 19th and 20th centuries. The next important political transition was from a tribal to a state-level society. Again, we're talking about the emergence of the state. A state, in contrast to a band or tribe-level society, possesses a monopoly on legitimate coercion and exercises that power over a defined territory. Again, we're talking about territorialism. And because they are centralized and hierarchical, states tend to produce higher degrees of social inequality than earlier kinship-based forms of organization. There are in turn two broad types of state, in those described by the sociologist Max Weber. As patrimonial, the polity is considered a type of personal property of the ruler, and state administration is essentially an extension of the ruler's household. The natural forms of sociability, reliance on family and friends, are still at work in patrimonial states. A modern state, however, in contrast, is impersonal. A citizen's relationship to the ruler does not depend on personal ties, but simply on one's status as a citizen. State administration does consist of the recruitment to administrative positions based on impersonal criteria such as merit, education, or technical knowledge. And so we have the transition from patrimonial state to a meritorial state. A pristine state formation, the formation of the first states out of tribal societies, for example, there were necessarily a number of interacting factors at work, such as the availability of agricultural surpluses and the technology to support them around the transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, and a certain level of population density. Physical circumscription, the bounding of territories by impassable mountains, deserts, or waterways, allowed rulers to exercise coercive power over populations and prevented enslaved or subordinated individuals from running away. Patrimonial states began to form in many parts of the world around 8,000 years ago, primarily in fertile alluvial valleys in Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, and the Valley of Mexico. China, for example, was the first world civilization that was able to establish a non-patrimonial modern state, which it did some 18 centuries before similar political units appeared in Europe. State building in China was driven by the same circumstances that necessitated centralized states in early modern Europe, that of prolonged and pervasive military competition. Military struggle created incentives to tax populations, to create administrative hierarchies, to provision armies, and to establish merit and competence rather than personal ties as the basis for recruitment and promotion. And so instead of having like a kinship system, we have more of a meritorial system. China did this by inventing the civil service examination as early as the 3rd century BCE. Both the Arabs and Ottomans came up with a novel approach to the same problem, the institution of slave soldiers. In Europe, this problem was solved on a social rather than a political level. Early in the Middle Ages or medieval era, the Catholic Church changed the rules of inheritance to make it much more difficult for kin groups to pass resources down to their extended families. As a result, extended kinship among the Germanic barbarian tribes dissolved within a generation of two of their conversion to the Christian religion, for example. Kinship was ultimately replaced by a more modern form of social relationship based on a legal contract. And of course, as you know in history, this is known as feudalism. Next, we will talk about the rule of law. The rule of law, understood as rules that are binding, even on the most politically powerful actors in history in a given society, has its origins in religion. It is only religious authority that was capable of creating rules that warriors needed to respect. Religious institutions in many cultures were essentially legal bodies responsible for interpreting a set of sacred texts and giving them moral sanction over the rest of society. Thus, in India, for example, the Brahmin class of priests was understood to be higher in authority than the warrior class, who held actual political power. A Raja, or king, would have to seek a legitimation from a Brahmin priest before he could rightly rule. In Islam, for example, the Sharia law was presided over by a separate hierarchy of scholars known as the ulama, a network of qadis, or judges, who did the routine work of administering religious law. Though early caliphs united political and religious authority in the same person, in other periods of Islamic history, the caliph and sultan were separate individuals, and the former, that of the caliph, could act as a constraint on the latter, the sultan. The rule of law was most deeply institutionalized in Western Europe due to the role of the Roman Catholic Church. And it was only in the Western tradition did the church emerge as a centralized, hierarchical, and resource-rich political actor whose behavior could dramatically affect the political fortunes of kings and emperors. The central event marking the autonomy of the church was the investiture conflict that began in the 11th century, respectively. And this clash pitted the church against the Holy Roman Emperor. And it was over the question of the latter's interference in religious matters. Again, this was the investiture controversy. In the 11th century. In the end, the church won the right to appoint its own priests and bishops and emerged as the guardian of a revised Roman law based on the 6th century Corpus Juris Civilis, or commonly referred to as the Justinian Code. England developed an equally strong but different legal tradition called the Common Law, which emerged after the Norman conquest out of the law of the King's Court. There it was promoted less by the church than by early monarchs who used their ability to dispense impersonal justice as a means of cementing their legitimacy. And thus, in Western Europe, law was the first of the three major institutions to emerge at that time. China, for example, never developed a transcendental religion, perhaps for this reason, and it never developed a true rule of law. There, the state emerged first, and up to the present day, law has never existed as a fundamental constraint on political power. And of course, we know in a lot of the Eastern histories, we have a more philosophical, more kind of a philosophical kind of transcendentalism as opposed to an actual religious one. The sequence was reversed, however, in Europe. Law preceded the rise of the modern state, instead of the modern state preceding the rise of law. When European monarchs aspired to behave like Chinese imperators from the late 16th century onward and create modern centralized absolutist states, they had to do so against the backdrop of an existing legal order that limited their powers. The result was that few European monarchs ever acquired the concentrated powers of the Chinese state, despite aspirations to do so. Only in Russia, for example, where the Eastern Church was always subordinated to the state, did such a regime emerge. And again, that is on concentrated powers of the state. The third thing that we talk about is democratic accountability. The last of the three sets of institutions to emerge after the development, or the emergence rather, of the state and a rule of law is democratic accountability. The central mechanism of accountability, such as, for example, Parliament, evolved out of the feudal institution of estates. These institutions represented the elites in society, the upper nobility, the gentry, and in some cases the bourgeoisie in independent cities. Under feudal law, monarchs were required to go to these bodies to raise taxes, since they represented the asset-owning elites in the agrarian societies of the time. Beginning in the late 16th century, ambitious monarchs deploying novel theories of absolute sovereignty undertook campaigns to undermine the powers of these estates and to acquire the right to tax their populations directly. In each European country, this struggle played out over the next 2 centuries. Again, we're talking about the 17th and 18th centuries. In France and Spain, for example, we talk the monarchy succeeded in reducing the power of estates though they remained enmeshed in a existing system of law that continued to limit their ability to simply expropriate the property of their elite subjects. In Poland and Hungary, for example, the estates were victorious over the monarch, creating a weak central authority which dominated a rapacious elite that were in time conquered by their neighbors. In Russia, however, the estates and the elites supporting them were less well established than their Western European counterparts, and law exerted a much weaker influence, and as a result, a more robust form of absolutism emerged. Only in England, however, was there a relatively even contest between the king and the estates. When the early Stuart kings sought to build absolutionist powers, they found themselves blocked by a well-organized and armed parliament. Many members of this body were, in contrast to the monarch's high church Anglicanism, Puritan Protestants who believed in more grassroots forms of government organization. The parliamentary forces brought a civil war, beheaded King Charles I, and briefly established a parliamentary dictatorship under the man named Oliver Cromwell. This conflict continued through the Restoration and culminated in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 89, wherein the Stuart dynasty was deposed and a new monarch, that of William of Orange, agreed to a constitutional settlement and a new monarch. This new monarch, William of Orange, agreed to a constitutional settlement embodying the principle of, quote, no taxation without representation. Accompanying William of Orange and his wife Mary from the Netherlands to London was the philosopher John Locke, whose second treatise on government enunciated the principle that obedience to rule should rest on the consent of the governed. John Locke argued that rights were natural and inherent in human beings qua human beings. Governments existed only to protect these rights and could be overturned if they violated them. These principles, no taxation without representation, and the consent of the governed, would become the rallying cry of the American colonists when they revolted against British authority less than a century later, in the year 1776. Thomas Jefferson, for example, incorporated the ideas of John Locke of natural rights into the American Declaration of Independence, and the idea of popular sovereignty would become the basis of the Constitution that was ratified in the year 1789. Again, that was the year of the French Revolution. And while these new political orders established the principle of accountability, neither England in 1689 nor the United States in 1789 could be considered a modern democracy at the time. The franchise was restricted in both countries to white male property owners who represented a very small part of the entire population. Neither the Glorious Revolution nor the American Revolution produced anything like a genuine social revolution. The American Revolution was led by a merchant planter gentry elite who were jealous of the rights that the British king had infringed. These same elites remained in charge once independence was achieved, and they were the ones who drafted and approved the new country's constitution. To focus on these limitations, however, is to radically underestimate the political dynamic that the new American order set and the power of ideas. The Declaration of Independence boldly declared that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. The Constitution squarely vested sovereignty not in the king or in an amorphous state, but rather in we the people. And again, these documents did not seek to recreate Britain's hierarchical, class-defined society in North America. While there were many political and social barriers to de facto equality in the United States over the next 2 centuries, the burden was on anyone claiming special rights or privileges for a particular class to justify how they were compatible with the nation's founding creed. This was one reason why the franchise was expanded to all white males and a little more than a generation after ratification of the Constitution, long before any country in Europe was to do so. And again, we're talking about the Civil War. And, of course, the antebellum period was between the American Revolution and the Civil War. The Civil War, of course, ended on April the 9th in 1865, a little after Abraham Lincoln would be assassinated. The contradictions between founding principles and social reality came to a head in the decades before the Civil War, as Southern defenders of their peculiar institution, slavery, started to make novel arguments for why exclusion and subjugation of blacks was morally and politically justified. Again, just think about James Buchanan. Think about the Dred Scott and things of that nature. Some used religious arguments, some talked about a natural hierarchy among the races, and others defended it on the grounds of democracy itself. Stephen Douglas, in his debates with Abraham Lincoln, said he cared not whether a people voted slavery up or down, but that their democratic will should prevail. Again, Lincoln, however, made a decisive counter-argument that necessarily harked back to the founding. He wanted to preserve and continue the Union. He said that a country based on the principles of political equality and natural rights could not survive if it tolerated so blatantly contradictory an institution as slavery, and therefore we have the Emancipation Proclamation. As we know, it shamefully took another century after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery before African Americans finally won the political and judicial rights that they were promised by the 14th Amendment. But the country eventually came to understand that the equality proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence could not be made compatible with laws making some people second-class citizens. Many other social movements emerged in latter years that expanded the circle of people bearing natural and hence political rights, such as workers, women, indigenous peoples, and other formerly marginalized groups. But that would take a long time, and especially into the middle of the 20th century. The basic political order established by the Glorious Revolution and the American Revolution, an executive accountable to a representative legislature and to the whole society more broadly, would prove remarkably durable. No one subsequently argued that the government should not be accountable to the people. Latter debates and conflicts revolved entirely around the question of who counted as a full human being, whose dignity was marked by the ability to participate in the democratic political system of we the people, by the people, for the people. But it took a long time to understand who the people actually were. Third, we'll talk about the French Revolution, and then finally, we'll talk about laying the foundations. The other great revolution of the late 18th century took place in France. Gallons of ink have been spilled describing and interpreting this cataclysmic event, and the descendants of those on opposite sides still have not resolved some of the bitter controversies that it aroused. It may be surprising then that quite a number of observers, from Edmund Burke to Alexis de Tocqueville to the historian Francois Furet, have questioned whether the revolution was as consequential as many believed. The revolution was originally animated by the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which, like the Declaration of Independence, set forth a view of the universality of human rights grounded in the laws of nature, or natura. But the First Republic was short-lived. Like the Bolshevik and Chinese revolutions that were to follow, it established its own revolutionary dynamic of radicalization, in which today's left-wingers became tomorrow's counter-revolutionaries, a cycle that led to the Committee of Public Safety and Reign of Terror, in which the revolution devoured its own children. This unstable process was brought to an end by external war, and finally the one that brought Napoleon Bonaparte to power in the year 1799. The violence of the revolution and the violence of the counter-revolution engendered a deep polarization in French society that made incremental political reform of a British sort much harder to achieve. The French would experience the July Revolution of 1830, the Revolution of 1848, and then in the 1870s, occupation by Prussia and the Paris Commune, before a more enduring limited franchise democracy could be established. And by this point, there had been democratic elections under varying restrictive rules in many other European countries, including the arch-conservative Prussia. France, which had led the way toward democracy in 1789, proved to be something of a laggard. Worse, one of the revolution's legacies was a French left that in the 20th century was prone to glorify violence and attach itself to totalitarian causes, from that of Stalin's to that of Mao. Again, Stalin in Russia and Mao in China. And so the question is reasonably asked, what did the French Revolution achieve? If the answer was not establishment of democracy in France, it did have a great immediate and lasting impact in the other institutional domains. First, it led to the development and promulgation in 1804 of Europe's first modern law code, called the Civil Code, or that of Code Napoleon. And the second was the creation of a modern administrative state through which the code was implemented and enforced. Even in the absence of democracy, these constituted major advances that made government less arbitrary, more transparent, and more uniform in its treatment of citizens. Napoleon Bonaparte, looking backward after his defeat at Waterloo, claimed that the Civil Code, or Code Napoleon, constituted a great victory than any he had won on the battlefield. And indeed, he was right in many ways. French law up to that point was a varied form of from region to region, some inherited from the Roman law, some based on customary law, countless accretions that had been added over the centuries from ecclesiastical, feudal, commercial, and secular sources. The resulting tangle of laws was often self-contradictory or ambiguous. The Code Napoleon replaced all of this with a single modern code that was clear, cogent, elegantly written, and extremely compact. The Code Napoleon cemented many of the gains of the Revolution by eliminating from law feudal distinctions of rank and privilege. Land was freed of feudal and customary entails, opening the way for development of a market economy. Again, we have the system changing from a barter system to from a monetary system to now a credit system. But land was freed again of feudal and customary entails, opening the way for development of a market economy. Courts controlled by the local lord were abolished altogether and replaced with a uniform system of civil magistrates. The Code Napoleon was immediately exported to the countries France was then occupying, such as Belgium, Luxembourg, the German territories west of the Rhine River, for example, Rhenish Prussia, Geneva, and Parma. It was subsequently forcibly introduced into Italy and the Netherlands and in the Hanseatic territories. The Civil Code was voluntarily accepted by many of the smaller German states, and as we will see later, it was the body of law that was to become the inspiration for the reform of the Prussian Code that took place after the defeat of the French at Jena. It was used as a model for countless other civil codes outside of Europe, from Senegal to Argentina to Egypt and Japan. While legal codes forcibly imposed on other societies do not have a great record of success, the Code Napoleon did. countries like Italy and the Netherlands that resisted its adoption eventually ended up with laws that were very similar in substance, if not in name. The second major accomplishment of the French Revolution was the creation of a modern bureaucratic state, something that China had achieved a couple of millennia earlier. And again, that is several thousand years earlier. And so, beginning in the middle of the 17th century, centralized monarchs like Louis the 13th and Louis the 14th had created a modern system of administrators based on officials known as intendants. And sent from Paris to the provinces, they could govern impersonally. And this was the beginning of the modern centralized state in France. But the intendants had to operate in parallel with another administrative group, that of venal office holders. Starting with a major bankruptcy known as the Grand Party in 1557, the government resorted to increasingly desperate measures to raise money, including the sale of public offices to wealthy individuals. Under a system known as the Paulette, introduced in 1604 by Henry the Fourth's minister Sully, these offices could not only be bought, but also handed down to their children as part of their inheritance. These office holders, of course, had no interest in impersonal public administration or good government. What they wanted was their offices for all they were worth. And all their French governments of the late 18th century made two major efforts to eliminate the venal office holders. Both were defeated because this elite group held great power and had too much to lose in a result of reform. And at this time, we have King Louis, the transition power from King Louis XV to King Louis XVI. And the rottenness and unreformability of this system was one of the factors leading to the revolution itself. And during that event, all of the venal office holders were dispossessed of their offices and, in many cases, of their heads, for good measure. A new Conseil d'Etat would be created in 1799, an institution that would become the pinnacle of a truly modern bureaucratic system. The new administrative hierarchy would not have worked without the creation of a more modern educational system designed to support it. The old regime had established technical schools in the 18th century to train engineers and other specialists, but in the year 1794, the revolutionary government created a number of schools for the specific purpose of training civil servants. Such schools, the forerunners of the post-World War II world, were fed in turn by a system of elite secondary schools. These two institutional innovations, introduction of a new legal code and a creation of a modern administrative system, achieved certain egalitarian ends. The law no longer privileged certain classes to manipulate the system to their own advantage. It was now committed to the equal treatment of all individuals, in principle, if not always in reality. The law could not be implemented without the newly reformed bureaucracy, which was freed of the corrupt baggage it had accumulated over the centuries. Both together, law and an administrative state acted as a constraint on the arbitrariness of absolutionist rulers. The sovereign had theoretically unlimited powers, but he had to exercise them through a bureaucracy acting on the basis of law. It had a very different character from the totalitarian dictatorships that would arise in the 20th century under Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, whose reality was a despotic state constrained by either law or democratic accountability. And then we talk about laying the foundations. The American Revolution institutionalized democracy and the principle of political equality. The French Revolution, however, laid the basis for an impersonal modern state, much as the Qin unification had done in China. Both fortified and expanded the rule of law in its two versions, the common law and the civil code. The first volume of the book concluded just as the historical moment when the foundations for the three sets of institutions had been put in place, before any of them was fully developed into its modern form. And again, this is the French Revolution. In Europe and other parts of the world, law was the most developed institution. But in the case of the Code Napoleon, a great deal of work had to be done in order to formalize, codify, reconcile, and update laws in order to make them truly neutral with respect to persons. The idea of a modern state had been in Europe since the end of the 16th century, but no administration, including the bureaucracy in Paris, was fully merit-based. The vast majority of state administrators across the continent remained patrimonial, and even though the idea of democracy had been implanted in England, and particularly in its North American colonies, there was no society on earth in which a majority of the adult population could vote or participate in the political system. The Spanish and Portuguese conquests of the New World followed a century later by British and French settlement of North America. The British and Spanish empires were forced to retreat as a result of independence movements on the part of their New World colonies. The present volume thus is an account of how state law and democracy developed over the last 2 centuries. Again, we're talking about the 19th and 20th centuries, after the time of the Civil War in the Americas, how they interacted with one another and with the economic and social dimensions of development, and finally how they have shown signs of decay in the United States and in other developed democracies. And so there we have it. That is the introduction to Francis Fukuyama's New York Times best-selling book, Political Order and Political Decay, Volume 2, From the Industrial Revolution to the Globalization of Democracy.